You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 152. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast, which today is all about lawyers and ADHD. I'm thrilled to be inviting guest speaker Erin Peters, who will be talking about lawyers and ADHD. Erin is very well poised to talk about this subject. She is a former lawyer herself, having practiced both in Canada and in the UK, and she's now a psychotherapist and registered therapeutic counselor. She provides therapy-related services to adults, including lawyers and adults with ADHD. In addition to her counseling practice, Erin also provides training for lawyers on topics like burnout, anxiety, boundaries, confidence, parenting, all topics near and dear to my heart. Now, today's podcast episode is a deep dive into ADHD among lawyers. Erin is going to share with you some of the challenges that are common for lawyers in legal practice. She's also going to share proactive steps that you can take to deal with those challenges. Now, if you are listening to this episode and you have ADHD or you suspect that you have ADHD, I hope that one of the things you take away from this episode is that you are absolutely not alone. I hope it helps you to feel validated, to feel seen, heard, and understood, and to have increased understanding and insights into some of the challenges that are very common for lawyers with ADHD. Now, if you know somebody who you think would benefit from listening to this episode, then please do share it with them. I think this is one of those resources and one of those topics where the more we learn, the better we can support our fellow lawyers who have ADHD. So with that, I'm going to turn us over to the recording of my interview with Erin. Thank you again for joining us here this week. Thank you, Erin, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I know you're going to love hearing from Erin. Welcome, Erin, to the podcast. How are you today?
Thanks, Paula. I am feeling really great this morning, particularly to see some sunshine here in Vancouver.
Yes, we've been waiting a long time and spring has finally sprung. Thank you, Erin, for joining us on the podcast today. I'm really excited to have you here and excited to share the work that you're doing with our listeners. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the work that you do with lawyers.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Paula. I, as you know, am a former lawyer. I really like lawyers. And now as a psychotherapist, I see a lot of individual lawyers in my psychotherapy practice where we work on a variety of mental health and well-being topics. I also combine my former lawyer self, my psychotherapy self, and give webinars and workshops to lawyers, to law firms, to community groups that are based on lawyers and their well-being. So I sort of combine that personal and professional experience and every now and then talk about some ideas that I have.
Amazing. And Erin, that is how I first learned of you. I've seen you speak on a couple of webinars, one of them quite recent, right on this topic, lawyers and ADHD and wellness, produced by the CLE BC. And we're going to link to that in the notes. And really thrilled to have you here to share that knowledge and expertise. Before we do that, I'd love to learn more about you and what sparked your interest in the area of ADHD.
That's actually quite an interesting question for me. And when you asked me that to prepare for the show, I had to think back and reflect how I got here. I live in a neurodiverse family, and one of my young people has recently been talking about their career interests, some of their options, and in fact, they identified law. And when we were talking, it really suited their intellectual curiosity, their wide-ranging interests, their love of debate. And at the same time, I was seeing their own ADHD traits in front of me. So I was doing a lot of research and thinking about them. I was learning a lot more about ADHD. And of course, I started to bring that lens and recognize it, in fact, in many of my clinical clients, as you know, who are in fact lawyers. And to some degree, I could recognize the ways of being in myself. So it came about, as many things do, through some personal experience I've been living through, which has been appearing in my clinical practice. So I'm suddenly now working a lot more in the intersection of law, mental health, and neurodiversity, and here particularly ADHD.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Erin. And I can relate to what you're sharing as well on the podcast in terms of individuals in my personal life who are learning that they have ADHD, some of them quite close to me, and also in the work that I've been doing with lawyers, having them come to me and tell me that they have ADHD. Some of them have known for a long time, some of them have just recently learned. And so it's one of those areas that I think we are gaining so much more awareness of in this generation relative to certainly when I was younger. And I think just being able to learn more about it and how it impacts us, because certainly one can become a lawyer and be a very successful lawyer along with having ADHD. And if you have that knowledge to help you navigate that journey, it's just such a smoother ride. So super valuable, the work that you're doing. I would love for you to help our listeners understand what ADHD is. I imagine some are very well versed and others, this may be a new concept to them. So how would you describe it?
Well, as we know, the acronym ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And in that sense, it's been identified and listed as a disorder in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. That's published by the American Psychiatric Association. Now, that's a whole mouthful. And I say that up front because often when we hear the word disorder and we associate it with the acronym, we turn away from it. But for many of us living with and working in the field of ADHD, including myself, I understand ADHD more as a neurodivergence, so a difference in the way that our brains are wired and operate. So this is both neurological and biochemical. And so I like to view it rather than a disorder as this kind of difference. And as you mentioned, now and currently, we're more and more understanding and more embracing these differences in positive ways. And these differences have been scientifically measured and studied. And so now I like to think about, and we know that ADHD is both genetic, so it's an inheritable neurological trait, and it also is impacted by our early context, or what we call in the field our psychosocial conditions, when we were young, how we grew up, what we were surrounded by. It's present in children and adults, all ages, all ethnicities, across cultures. And it really does have the potential to impact how we operate in the world, both how we function and how we view ourselves. That's a long-winded introduction. Do you have any questions right there, Paula?
Erin, I really would love to highlight the way that you've described it, especially that second D, the disorder versus difference. And I fully resonate and agree with that description. I personally don't love the label disorder. I think difference is a much better way to describe it, especially when we start getting into the numbers. And I don't have the stats on my fingertips, but I've seen numbers of 10% of the population having ADHD and sometimes higher than that. And so I think when we're looking at such a significant percentage of the population, I don't like the label disorder because I think it implies that there's something that is wrong. I like to see it more as a difference, as in we're not all wired the same. And there are strengths and setbacks that accompany each set of those. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and really appreciate your description of it. Yeah. And we're going to talk more, I think, about how ADHD can show up for lawyers in a legal practice. So we'll get into some examples of that. But I think the way you've set it up is really helpful.
Yeah. And if I could add, Paula, we understand ADHD, and I'll just use that acronym between us now, to vary across a spectrum of experience as well. So ADHD doesn't look or sound the same in every person. And, I think if you go online or you do any research, you'll see identified general similarities, right? So it's characterized by what we call noticeable variations in attention, right? So this is the attention part of the label. And unfortunately, it has deficit behind it. Sometimes that attention can be hyper-focused. So people who experience ADHD can really get into that focused zone. So this is a superpower, that focused attention. And equally, at other times, be quite distracted or lose attention on what's in front of them. So the attention part is one of the common features of people who live with ADHD. The second one is what I call bursts of energy output. This is otherwise known as impulsivity. So this is marked by spontaneous action, not necessarily thinking before speaking or doing. People who have a lot of creative ideas, great impulses, often interrupt other people. So there's what I like to think of that energy burst or that energy output. And lastly, you'll see that it's marked by an intensity in energy. The H, sometimes it looks like hyperactivity. So we see typical cliche, the little bouncy little boy who's really hyperactive. But the intense energy can also be focused ambition, right? A lot of drive to do things, which shows up more, for example, in high achieving adults. So there's that attention, there's the bursting of the energy, and there's an intensity that I think characterizes how many people live with ADHD.
Yeah, I love that, Erin. And I think it touches on one of the points that I think you mentioned in one of the webinars that I saw you present. And I've heard this elsewhere as well, that women often go undiagnosed because they don't fit the typical description of the squirmy little boy in the classroom who is disrupting the teacher, right? That's kind of like the stereotypical idea of what ADHD looks like. But for some people, and I understand for women in particular, the symptom that you last described, maybe it's that intensity, that energy is more inward. And so they're not acting out from the outside observing them. They seem like they're doing the things they're supposed to be doing, but it presents inwardly. And so you can struggle for years without realizing that what you are actually struggling with is ADHD.
Yeah, exactly. And if we do another cliche, we see the good little girl in the classroom or doesn't get noticed, right? Because she is sitting quietly, looking like she's doing the things she should be doing. Yet internally, there can be a creative world unfolding in her mind, right? And she's noticing the sparkle of the leaves outside the classroom window. She's noticing the crunch of the paper of the kid beside her. She's imagining what her teacher had for breakfast. She's having a conversation with her friends in her head, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of activity going on internally in this body that's sitting quietly. And often girls in particular get overlooked, for example, for that kind of situation.
Totally. I feel like you just described my entire academic existence. Oh my gosh. Thank you. This leads us to that next question, Erin, which is, what is not ADHD?
Yeah. And you mentioned the CLDBC webinar I did, and I give that a little bit of attention right up front, really with the idea that we're trying to bust the myths of what ADHD is so that more of us can enter the conversation. And, we mentioned the wriggly little boys. ADHD is not confined to the hyperactive, wriggly little boys in the classroom. It has a much, much broader prevalence through all kinds of people, as we've been talking about. I feel quite strongly, more strongly the more I get into it, that ADHD isn't a trend. There's a bit of backlash in the discourse that, it's a North American fad. It's an easy way to dismiss what we're seeing in culture. But I really believe and want to emphasize that ADHD is actually real. It's real in our experience of it. It's also real diagnostically, right? We sit and get our brain activity measured, and we can see, the scientific data, the differences. It's also not an excuse, right, for laziness. And this is where a lot of people are challenged with even using the term ADHD. They don't want to understand themselves as not being able to. So it is challenging around the ideas of why can't I do things? So I believe it's not to be used, or it isn't, in fact, an excuse for not being able to do some things, nor is it someone's fault. There is a popular writer who puts a lot of emphasis on ADHD being primarily the result of early parenting or early experiences. And I think that can unfortunately shift blame or shift fault to the context, when in fact, what we're seeing and what we're understanding, as I said before, is that ADHD is both genetic and social. So I sort of steer away from that blaming the parents, blaming the early context lens when I think about ADHD. I also believe that ADHD is not unmanageable, right? As you said, it creates some setbacks and challenges, and yet it has a lot of upside. And ultimately, once we become aware of it and embrace how it operates in us, it does become very manageable.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. And as you were talking, you mentioned the blame aspect of it.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's really important for us to focus on, both in terms of, and I hadn't even thought about it the way that you described it, blaming the parents, right? The social environment for the ADHD, that being one aspect of it. But I also think for the person who's experiencing it, them blaming themselves for some of the challenges that they may have relative to, we'll call them the neurotypicals relative to others. And also, I think when you are in relationship with somebody who has ADHD and some of the things that may be more challenging for them, things that, maybe they show up late for your appointments, or they forget your birthday, or you need to ask them more than once to do something and remind them. And you may think of that as, they're doing this on purpose. They don't care about me. They're being disrespectful of my time. And yet it's not them. It's not to blame them. It's actually just something that is inherent and more difficult because of the way that they're wired. So I think that blame component of it is something that is really worth focusing on from multiple perspectives. So thank you for that. Erin, one of the things I talk about on the podcast that I'm quite interested in, and that I understand you're quite interested in too, is executive functioning skills. And that is a component of the ADHD, right? Deficiencies or challenges in terms of executive functioning. And I would love to hear from you how you would describe executive functioning skills.
Yeah, it is one really important feature. And it's one important feature, I think, that really helps us identify the conversation or the topic of ADHD, right? So we might, for example, be people who have high swings of emotion, but we don't initially look at that as a sign that there may be something else like ADHD going on. So executive functioning is one of the areas where, a lot of people first identify themselves in this neurodiverse space. So I'm really glad you flagged it for us to talk about. How I think about it, and I listed 5 verbs here. One is to identify. The next is to prioritize. The next is to organize. The next is to plan. And then the big one, actually to do the tasks, right? So there's a sequence of verbs here which go in order. And it actually took me a few minutes to put them in order, which is the prioritizing thing. And so these are all really important verbs, important things to do, to identify, think about, plan, get stuff done, as the young person in my house with ADHD says. And ideally, these tasks, these verbs are all done in advance of the event and without undue external pressure or stress. So, as you said, there are many successful lawyers with ADHD, and many people with ADHD can in fact get things done and often on time. But if you look at the context, their success usually comes with the support of a really good system or under significant external pressures, deadlines. But if we think for a minute about something else, so if you can imagine a big period of unstructured time, your excitement about all the things you can do in that time, right? Yet you see yourself again being unable to decide where even to start, or starting 10 different things, finishing very few of them, having a sense of the time evaporating again. Here I go again. Suddenly I'm losing all this time, despite your best intentions, despite your to-do list, right? So when you see this happening again and again, this is a sign that you are struggling with some of these executive functioning tasks.
Yeah. And going back to what you said at the beginning, with ADHD presenting differently for every person, what I think can be really helpful is to look at the different executive functioning skills and to ask yourself, where are you strong and where aren't you strong? So you listed the steps, right? Identifying the task, making the priorities, organizing, planning, doing. And so each of these is using a different set of executive functioning skills. And when for example, I'm really good at planning, but when it comes to action, then I really struggle, then you can find ways to start to support yourself better.
Yeah.
I would love to invite you to share some examples that you've seen among lawyers or maybe other individuals that you've worked with who have ADHD and how that can show up in terms of their experience of the workplace or even outside of the workplace.
Yeah, here I focused a little bit on thinking about how it shows up in the workplace. But, you do raise an interesting point, which I think we'll talk about a little bit further on, which is how things might look good in the workplace, but signs of challenge show up at home. But if we think for a minute about lawyers specifically, and we think about the environment in which we work, what I often see is that there are, for example, consistent patterns of time inefficiencies and write-offs. Right. So this is the lawyer or the associate or the partner who's always saying, I had to write off 50% of my time. Or, I thought the project would take me 3 hours, but I spent the whole weekend. So there's a real pattern of getting lost in the project, hyper-focusing on the task once they get to it, and losing time, losing money, being assessed annually for not being productive enough as a result. You think a little bit about lawyers with cyclical practices, right? So where there's more of a feast-famine style of the workflow. Here, what often happens is that these lawyers can't really use their downtime, that dip in time productively, right? So, you've got this list of non-billable activities you want to do, or great papers you're going to write, or marketing you're going to, get on with, and you just find yourself not being able to do it, right? In that downtime. Think now about lawyers who have a very diverse client base, so more and more clients with different matters, or the client base itself is growing. And so this is where, for example, you're moving up in seniority, you've been in the community for a while, your practice is developing and growing. And what we start to see here is multitasking. And what we start to see here is managing the work of associates or students, right? And so this is a space where lawyers with ADHD have the sense of it's too much to handle, right? And then that mountain of tasks becomes quite overwhelming. Think a little bit about lawyers who have large or complicated research or drafting tasks, right? And these are the people who just cannot get started and really have a hard time getting started on something that is long, will take a considerable amount of effort, will take an undetermined amount of time. Yet, paradoxically, when they do get started, they might have difficulties stopping, right? So this is where getting into the flow, losing time, as we talked about before, and stopping before the project is exhaustively completed to the nth degree. And so these are some of the spaces and the examples where I think with lawyers, we can start to see patterns consistent with ADHD.
Thank you so much, Erin. And it's funny because these examples are ones that come up so often in conversations that I have with lawyers. That cyclical nature of the work. Some lawyers who really struggle with their time, estimating time, being efficient with their time on projects. That shift that happens when they start moving up in seniority and they're no longer just focused on their own work, they're managing their teams. So these are really relatable examples. And what I'd love to know from you is how you would assess, right, when you're looking at the spectrum, right, of you're the average, again, we'll say neurotypical lawyer who's dealing with the challenges of practice versus if you are on the ADHD side of the line and you're dealing with that, where do you draw the line? What's the threshold that you're thinking about that would tip you into ADHD?
Yeah, and the threshold I use often is it creating problems for you, right? Because, some people may live with ADHD, have all these things happen in their lives and not be bothered about it at all, right? The threshold question becomes one of function. And these are the kinds of people who probably come into your office, come into my office, where there is some challenge that's being presented by something, and often one of these things that starts to appear. So, for example, I have a long-term client who came in saying, I'm really struggling with procrastination. And at that point, we didn't even know about ADHD in the framework. But I think, some of the things to think about are how we use or how the client uses their unstructured time, right? As we talked about earlier. So if we're looking also at patterns that are happening outside of work, Right? So it's something is happening on the home front that is consistent with an ADHD challenge. We're seeing outcomes or functioning problems that are really creating problems for us across the board. Not planning, making spontaneous purchases, as you were saying before, forgetting our friends and family's important events. We can often see too, and I see this clinically, is that when we try and measure our sort of day-to-day or for ourselves, our normal level of anxiety, right? So your listeners can't see this, but I'm moving my hands up and down. So if I put my hands somewhere around a midline on a vertical axis, let's say this is my normal anxiety. Many people with ADHD, you can imagine my hands going up, right, to over my head. They operate with quite a high resting level or normal level of anxiety. It's the constant motion, the constant energy, the constant doing that sort of permeates most of their day-to-day experience. So often that anxiety is a sign that, you've gone beyond a manageable level of functioning. We also see quite a strong relationship and reliance on substances, either to get started. So we see caffeine or other stimulants, cocaine, or substances to numb that anxiety and the overwhelm of that experience. So nicotine, cannabis, substance addictions often sit alongside of people who have been unassessed for ADHD and been living with ADHD for most of their lives. We also see quite a pervasive sense of failure or imposter syndrome or shame. And this is in marked contrast to what other people see. So other people might say, wow, how do you do it all? Or wow, you've got 4 degrees. Or, wow, you look like you've got it all together. And yet the person themselves doesn't connect with their obvious external achievements. They carry around this sense of, I'm not good enough. Here I go again, making another mistake. I'm such a screw up. So that really pervasive sense of negativity or self-criticism can also be a sign here that, we're moving into struggles, with our way of being, with living with ADHD.
Thank you so much, Erin. So it sounds like if you're experiencing this and there are these heightened levels of anxiety, if you find yourself relying on a lot of coffee to get started, a lot of wine to wind down at night. If it's becoming problematic, I can imagine and frankly relate to this idea of the busyness that goes on inside when you're trying to manage all of these different aspects of your thinking and doing. You're likely expending a lot more energy than somebody who isn't doing that same thing. And you mentioned at the end this idea that your self-concept can be really impacted by your ADHD. So this imposter syndrome, having a very different view of yourself relative to others who are seeing you from the outside. What are some of the ways that ADHD does impact self-concept that you've seen?
Yeah, and this is a very broad list. And I'll be sharing things with you that obviously we see and occur in people who don't have ADHD. So these aren't unique to ADHD, but they are things that do occur. One of the things I talked about earlier was in terms of executive function, not being able to identify what is important. What I see with many people with ADHD is their sense of themselves is quite diffuse, and they're not able necessarily to identify their own wants or needs. So if I ask a hypothetical question, if you could do anything you wanted to, didn't have all this mountain of stuff to do, what would you like to do? Interestingly, there's often a pause, this sort of, I don't know, right? So there's often a sense of really in that moment of calm, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with it, right? So there's this quite a marked unknowing, right, of what's going on underneath all this action that I usually live with. There can be some challenge with connecting to your emotions, right? And our emotional life is a rich place of self-knowledge, of information, of sparking ideas for how we're going to live in the world and make meaning. Many people with ADHD, and particularly many lawyers with ADHD, have very, very strong cognitive intelligence and yet struggle to connect with or drop out of that busy mind into their more emotional selves. And so feel like something's missing and they can't quite put their finger on it. We're also seeing something that's being talked more openly about, rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So this is where there's a real highly sensitive reaction to a perceived sense of not being liked, of not being approved of, not being welcomed. And this can go hand in hand, particularly with women with this tendency to people please, right? I always want to make sure the other person is okay first. And in that, we get an erosion of personal boundaries. So when we have a hard time knowing what it is we want, we are sensitive to others' perception of us, and we desire to please them first. Our boundaries tend to be quite porous, if existent at all. We can have challenges with socializing and social anxiety. So there can be both a desire to connect with other people, which many people with ADHD really hold, real deep desire to connect, be with others, yet anxiety around how to do that. Am I saying the right thing? The sensory stimulation is way too overwhelming. There's too much some of the time. And sometimes what people end up doing is enacting sort of this forced extrovertedness, right? They become really jolly. They get a glass of wine and they're really trying to connect, but it's actually quite an uncomfortable space. We've got, as we talked about, this fear of failure, imposter syndrome. What is really common in people with ADHD that I work with is a sense of being stuck or an inertia. I don't know. I can't decide. How do I move forward? I know I want to be doing something different, but I don't know what it is. I know there are two choices. How do I choose which choice to make? So in terms of sense of self, or this sense of being stuck is quite prevalent. And it's often what brings people into my therapy room. There's something here. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to get through it. And, as we talked about, there can be experiences of high anxiety. And with many people with ADHD, there is a concurrent swing to a low depression. So many people with ADHD actually have a very intense experience living in the world. And if that experience can also be an emotional experience. So the anxiety, when it's up, goes way, way up on an arc. And the depression, when it comes, goes way, way down in a trough. And at the bottom of the trough, we do see some existential crisis. What am I doing here? What's the point? And that's where questions of should I be living in the world can pop up for many people. And as a culture, we're quite afraid of that, right? And having those conversations. Yet it's important, I think, to recognize that it does happen.
Erin, this is such a helpful discussion. Thank you so much. As you were going through those different factors, number one, I think there are questions that come up so much with lawyers, and I'm thinking about the context that lawyers are practicing in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just lawyers, but particular to law, this idea of someone with ADHD maybe struggling more with what they actually want. And as a culture, law is kind of a good place for that because there's such a machine that will carry someone through from law school into articles into the firm. And then after a few years, there's kind of this point where you're set free, right? Where all of a sudden the onus shifts to you to make the decisions, to decide what you want and to go after it. And I find that's where a lot of lawyers start to question, right? What are they doing? Many of them feel stuck, right? That last point that you mentioned, that maybe it's not working for them, but they may or may not know how to move forward. I think that idea of having a bit of a disconnect with your emotion, and particularly as a lawyer, where so much of the focus is on what is the law, what are the facts, the emotional component, isn't usually the most persuasive part of the argument, right? We tend, at least when I was practicing in the nature of work that I was doing, that was really put to the side, right? The emotions were not central. And so I think if you're already struggling to connect with your emotions and now you're in the environment of law, it's one that will reinforce that, I think. And then you mentioned the rejection sensitivity. I mean, you mentioned a number of factors. There's also the social anxiety. But I think that rejection sensitivity as well in a culture of law, right? When you think of the adversarial nature of litigation, for example, or, the perfectionism that people aspire to and the standards that people are expected to meet, and that rejection sensitivity would be something then that I imagine would be triggered quite a bit in just the context of the day-to-day. So I think the way you've described it is so helpful because I think for all of us, we can see ourselves in certain aspects of this. And as we discussed earlier, whether or not that tips you into ADHD would then, I imagine, be that question of how much is it interfering with the day-to-day? And so I'm sort of just turning this back over to you, but what are your thoughts there, like in terms of these characteristics? And I think you mentioned at the beginning, they're common to everybody, but there's a certain threshold that you'd reach in the ADHD aspect of it.
It is individual. I think I would pick up on your just fantastic observation that the profession of law and its way it works, its requirements, the way it asks us to think logically, think analytically, the modern adaptation with 24/7 business culture. If you just start to think about the ways in which the profession asks lawyers to be, you can see where it's almost designed to trigger someone with ADHD in very sensitive points, right? So let's take mistakes. Mistakes aren't an option in law. At least they weren't when I was there. And I think they're still not an option, right? We're not about making mistakes. We're about being duly diligent, doing all the research, getting close enough to the right answer that we can for the client. Someone with ADHD is wired to have a mortal fear of making mistakes, right? So you combine already what is a part of one's personality or psychology, put it in a system that says, we don't do mistakes here. That just really squeezes and intensifies that person's experience, right? Of mistakes and the anxiety and the self-criticism and the self-judgment that come with that. And we could probably do that over a whole range of factors, of how the law works, how it asks us to be, match it up against another sensitivity or experience of people with ADHD, and really start to see how structurally being in certain practice areas or certain types of practice or certain law firm environments can really impact a particular person and how they live with an ADHD way of being.
Thank you, Erin. And the other thing that came to mind as you were talking about that is for the person who is attracted to that environment, people who have those characteristics may be self-selecting into that environment because it's familiar and, it speaks to them. So I think just being aware of this is probably very helpful for those who are listening, right? And asking themselves questions about how they're practicing and some of the challenges that they are experiencing.
And it may be as simple as changing practice area for some people, or, moving to a firm with a different remuneration structure that's less pressurized around time. It may be that working in a team environment is better as a team member than being a manager of a whole host of other associates. So, once we're aware of how ADHD shows up for us, and we start to reflect on how it matches up or mismatches with our work context, then suddenly there become all kinds of creative potentials for making changes that can really alleviate some stress.
And I'd love to turn, and we're going to do this in a minute, to some of the suggestions, some of the strategies, ways that people can support themselves with ADHD. If you're working with somebody who has ADHD, how you can support them. One last question before that, which is to address the paradox, almost the high achiever with ADHD. What are some of the unique challenges that you might face in that situation?
Yeah, and that is so common, and it's particularly common in lawyers. We're really seeing that many women who are very high achieving across life, who are starting to explore the question of ADHD. And I think one of the first challenges is the threshold challenge, that in fact, ADHD isn't recognized as even possible with people who in the normal world achieve so highly. So in fact, just this week, a client of mine reported that her family doctor said, well, with all that you've accomplished, there's no way you have ADHD. So I do think there is that myth-busting element, that threshold question is one of the most significant challenges with those of us, who have lived a life that on paper is very highly achieving, yet have felt a little bit different or have wondered why we've struggled over here when other people don't seem to struggle. So really, I'd say for me, that's one of the big challenges for high achievers with ADHD is really just recognizing it in the first place. I think too, as you mentioned earlier, we can sometimes see it as an excuse or blame ourselves, right? So let's say I start to understand that I might have traits of ADHD, or maybe I have ADHD. It then becomes another thing that because I'm so capable, I can or I should fix, usually myself, right? Because I have the skills. And so when I can't, quote unquote, fix it by myself the way that I've always done, then there can be a real sense of frustration, of hopelessness, and sometimes even of shame, right? So suddenly there's this thing that I've identified and I've analyzed and I've got, can't do anything about it by myself. And that is a really challenging place for high achievers to be in. I can't. That becomes quite a significant challenge too. I think with high achievers, there's a lot of curiosity, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of intellectual enjoyment of puzzles. There's also people who struggle with ADHD, a different sense of time. So what all these things bundled up together mean that there are a lot of unrealized great ideas, right? So you will see high achievers and you will read about people with ADHD having a resume with 50 different things on them, right? Some of which are finished, many of which aren't. And I think actually when we stand and look at all the great ideas we've had, yet haven't finished, that also can be a challenge to high achievers, is the sense of, well, here I go again. I was all excited about it, got it all started, made the investment, got the website, and then I didn't do it again, right? So there can be this self-criticism again when we don't realize all of our great ideas. And we usually have lots of them. And I think, as we've talked about before, particularly with the drive and sometimes the anxiety that goes with living with ADHD and high achievement, the personal price of that achievement can be quite high, yet somehow the achievements never seem enough, even when we're surrounded by all the external awards or other people saying, wow. We do sometimes carry this sense of it's still not enough, or it doesn't really mean anything, really. So I think that can be a challenge too with high achievers with ADHD.
Thank you, Erin. And just circling back to some of the language that you used, right? That internal dialogue, the here I go again, or it's still not enough. I think gaining that awareness in terms of what we're actually telling ourselves gives us that first data point, right? Wait a second, this is my internal messaging. From there, I think you can move into places where you're actually changing that message into something that's a lot friendlier. So I love that you're giving these examples, because my guess is that for many people who are listening, they might be able to relate to that, right? Or some aspect of this, and to know that this is actually something that doesn't have to be that way, that you can seek out support, right? Even though, as you mentioned, for super high achievers, there is this instinct to want to do it all ourselves. We don't have to, right? We can reach out for help. If you are someone who has ADHD, or you think you have ADHD, what steps might you be able to take to better support yourself?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think what I would say, what you don't have to do first is go to the doctor and get an assessment, because I think that step is off-putting for a lot of people and pushes people away from just opening to the ideas. So I would say, as a first step, education, right? Listen to podcasts, talk to other people who are exploring the conversation, talk to other people like you who are exploring the conversation. Talking to me, I'm a middle-aged female mother, professional, former lawyer. I'm going to have more probably synergy and similar questions to someone else like me than, a younger person who has a completely different experience. So I would say, self-education, talking to others who are similarly situated would be a huge thing you could do for yourself if you're listening and you're wondering about some of the ideas. I would say, secondly, that lifestyle changes are really important to consider. So these are things like really having a look at, are you taking care of the essentials of self-care? How's your food? How's your sleep? How's your exercise? Often people with ADHD, and often women with ADHD, are last on their priority list. And so if we manage to feed ourselves some days, we're lucky. And often people who start to think about how overwhelming their daily experience can be, and start to pay attention to those foundational, essential self-care things, food, water, movement, can really start to top up the tank to be able to deal with life every day from a more grounded, from a more regulated place. So sometimes, looking at a lifestyle change, just one, a simple one, can be really important. And here I would say that thinking about the idea of subtracting what you've got on your plate for the time being, rather than adding to your plate, would be something to keep in mind. That we're trying to do a little bit less so that we can do. I would also say, as you've mentioned, reach out for support, right? If it's a friend, if it's a buddy, if it's a professional, I would say we do need and benefit from supports for making even what seem like simple habit changes. Because for those of us with ADHD, if they were simple, we would have done them, right? We really benefit from buddies, right? And although intellectually we might be able to read Google and know all the ideas and all the life hacks about, for example, how to organize our day better, our reality is that putting that into practice on our own still remains challenging. So this is where really leaning into support, getting a coach, right, for talking through different habit change ideas. If you're struggling more with the emotional or psychological side of this new reality, maybe I have ADHD, connect with a counselor or a therapist, but really lean into the idea of support. As you mentioned, Ed Hallowell, one of his number one rules as a person living with ADHD is don't worry alone. And lastly, I would consider, if it's helpful for you, getting a formal assessment and considering medication. Many people have mixed views about medication. Medication certainly is safe and helps people focus when they can't focus. Yet some people stay away from that. Yet many people find that it can be supportive. So I would consider talking to your doctor, consider whether or not you need an assessment and whether or not medications might be something that could support you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Erin. And I think you mentioned that you were going to share some resources, so we can link to those in the notes with the episode. I love that there is such great information available online. So, that first step you suggested, right? Just getting out there. Nobody needs to know that you're listening to the podcast or doing the research and reading the books, right? You can do that on your own. And then as you move forward, I love this idea of self-care, right? Making sure you've got your basic nutrition, you're getting exercise, you're getting sleep so that you're better able to function. And, that point about community is so helpful, right? We don't have to worry alone. I think also that idea that the knowledge versus action gap is where many of us struggle, particularly when you have ADHD, right? Is what you should be doing, what you want to do, what you've told yourself you want to do. And yet there can be that energetic hurdle of getting started. So these are all really helpful suggestions. One last question, which is for those of us who are looking to support others who have ADHD, whether it's at the workplace or maybe somebody who's close to you in your personal life, how can we support others who have ADHD?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, again, I would say a little education goes a long way. So just trying to be informed about how ADHD might show up for the person in your life, the person you're talking about, and ask them how it shows up or how they are in the world. But I think even more importantly, the person we are responsible for and the only person we can change is ourselves. So if we are being impacted by someone in our life with ADHD tendencies, I think it's really important that we think about and be clear about what is impacting us, right? And try and give kind and clear feedback to the person. I find that often for those of us with ADHD, there can be real comfort when someone can give us the benefit of plain talk, plain speaking, right? So many people with ADHD are relieved even when things are known or made clear. The word is said, the concept is identified. So rather than avoid conversations, I would think about and encourage us to try and give kind and clear feedback, right? There's a relief or a kindness in this. And so I'm thinking about myself, when my family finally, after some decades, lovingly identified my quirks with time, I was a little bit embarrassed, but mostly I was just so relieved that we were talking about it and we could do something about it, with a smile on our face rather than this cloud of misunderstanding. I would also try and resist giving unsolicited advice, right? So ADHD folks are, as we talked about, really sensitive to perceived criticism, but also really important need to retain a sense of their own agency, right, when possible. So to avoid the figurative arms crossed, don't tell me what to do, right? It's helpful to give feedback, to ask questions, to make yourself available to brainstorm ideas when you're asked, but really to try and avoid nagging, reminding, telling, oh, here's a book I think you should read, right? And I think also, and this is more and more important, I think for all of us, ADHD or not, is that we could practice acknowledging and speaking about the positive things we see in the person we care about. ADHDers are notoriously hard on themselves and also neurologically wired to revert more so than neurotypicals to the negative, right? We can help them by acknowledging and noticing the positive side of their choices, the delight in the different behaviors, little things often. And this also works to shift our own perspective and attitude toward them. So rather than seeing the ADHD person in our life as the problem, we're seeing the benefit and the joy in them as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Erin. These are such wonderful suggestions. And I wholeheartedly agree with the suggestion of open conversation, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you think of the example of the friend that maybe is always late for lunch, and to be able to have that discussion. So it's not something that one person may be questioning or wondering about, why are they always late? Maybe they don't really care about having lunch with me. And giving that person an opportunity, right, to kind of maybe explain or to come up with solutions for how to do things in a way that works better for everybody going forward. So I really appreciate that. And I wish we could have another hour for our conversation, because I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. But I know you have a life to live, so I'm going to have to let you go. But I would love for you to share with our listeners, how people can find you, how you work with lawyers, and, how they can find you, whether it's for counseling, whether it's for a webinar presentation about one of the topics that you talk about.
The main place to find me is on my website, which is erinpeterscounseling.com, soon to be revamped, but the same URL. The bulk of my work is an individual therapy practice, and I focus on questions of identity, some of the relational traumas and shame that are related to experience we haven't yet understood or recognized, like ADHD, understanding how ADHD impacts ourselves and our relationships, particularly if we are coming to the question a little bit later in life. So again, you can find me on my website. I'm always happy to talk to groups, organizations, firms, people like yourselves looking to further conversations about lawyers, well-being, ADHD, and my contact details are on my website as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Erin. And one last thank you. I mean, I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast. I think what you've shared is amazing and so helpful. And all the work that you've already done, right, with the webinars and discussions that you have had, I think are such a resource for all of us, right? All of us who have questions about the topics you've covered, mental health, you've talked about boundaries. These are really gifts for all of us. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, and such a pleasure to have you on today. So thank you. And thank you everyone who joined us for today's conversation. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.